Jim Farlow is a professor of geology in the IPFW Department of Geosciences. He's been a faculty member at IPFW since 1982, having received his doctorate in geology at Yale University. That was after Bill and Hillary and all those were there, so, and Al, I think, as well. As many of you know, his chief research interest is in dinosaurs. He's conducted field work in Texas and New England. He's been to the western U.S., Spain, and Australia. And he has done a number of things, and he has carried out experimental studies of footprint formation by emus and other big birds in many zoos, including right here in our Fort Wayne Children's Zoo. He's authored a number of papers, technical papers, 2 books, some children's books, and so I am going to get out of his way and introduce to you our own dinosaur man here at IPFW, internationally recognized expert, Dr. Jim Farlow.
Thank you. I'm going to have to start by apologizing a little bit for how my voice may sound over the course of the evening. I'm just getting over this incredible cold, or whatever it is. Some nasty thing started nailing me on Friday, scratchiness, and I've had trouble sleeping for the last several days because of choking at night, and I'm only now getting over it. And even now, occasionally, the room will start to sway if I move too quickly. If that should happen, try not to be too alarmed. There have been times in the last few days when I thought it was going to be more appropriate to refer to me as the extinguished lecturer. But we'll try to soldier on as best we can. Right now, I need my first drink. Okay, we're going to be using slides and transparencies throughout my presentation tonight, and so I think I'm going to go right to those. Well, the first thing I want to do tonight is to get you some idea of what dinosaur footprints look like, particularly the kinds that I work on. And once I give you this brief travelogue of dinosaur footprints, then I will talk a little bit about the kinds of problems that I'm interested in. And I hope this will set the stage for what we're looking for in this project. When you're studying dinosaur footprints, it's always a good thing to keep in mind that they aren't around anymore, and so you don't have to worry about looking over your shoulder to see what might be coming upon you. This is a very nice dinosaur footprint site on the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona. And you can see there's a human to give you scale. You can see these 3-toe depressions in the solid rock there. The dinosaurs did not walk through this surface stomping their feet very hard and making holes in the rock. Instead, at the time the dinosaurs were in this area, a couple 100 million years or so ago, give or take a week, it was soft mud. The animals walked in the substrate, the footprint was recorded, and then ultimately the mud was converted to stone, and that's how the prints are preserved. A few more examples. This one might be a tad harder to see, at least it is for me, but it's right here, just a small, wee little thing. And you can see it's a 3-toed little jobber. I apparently have no control over the focus. And no one else does either, so we'll go right ahead. Here are a number of footprints in a riverbed in Texas, the Paluxy River, a little creek in north-central Texas where I've done a lot of my field work. Here we see some big footprints there. Where there's one, there's the next one, and there's the footprint after that. And one of the things you can get from a study of dinosaur footprints is how the beasts walked, how they carried their weight as they moved. Now, even though the footprints are in the bed of a river, the dinosaurs did not cross the river. They were there before the river. The river has eaten down through the overlying rock layers to expose the layer that the animals walked on, in this case about 110 million years ago. Here we have another dinosaur footprint site in central Texas, this one in Austin. Here's a little print. There's the next one in the series. This would have been a cute little dinosaur, about the size of a human being, 4 footprints of the beast in sequence. Now, this trail and the one before it will give you some idea of the normal walking step length of a dinosaur, but occasionally, for one reason or another, they got bees in their bonnet, and they moved a little faster than that. Here we have a footprint, and there's a hammer to give you the scale. There is the next footprint in the sequence. This particular dinosaur was probably moving a good deal faster than the other ones we've been looking at. You can find dinosaur footprints at sites all over the world. They are not rare fossils at all. Under the right geologic conditions, they can be extremely abundant, often much more abundant than dinosaur skeletons. This is from a site in Australia. The local people there, way out in literally the middle of nowhere in the outback of Queensland, they have put up this little sign for their dinosaur footprints. And that's a scruffy Australian paleontologist to contrast with the handsome, clean-cut variety in front of you this evening. Here we have one of the big footprints at that site. You notice, again, it's a three-toed job. I'm going to be talking about three-toed dinosaur prints this evening because those are the kind that interest me. Three-toed prints were made by dinosaurs that walked on their hind legs, bipedal dinosaurs, and they come in two basic varieties, plant eaters and meat eaters. The meat eaters and their relatives we collectively refer to as the theropods, but there are a number of groups within the theropods, and then there are some others, plant-eating dinosaurs, the lizzutosaurs and the ornithopods, and I've written down some of these names that you're free to write down and try to impress people at cocktail parties with at your leisure. Sometimes with these prints you get a very good preservation of the tracks. This is a footprint at a collection in Amherst College in Massachusetts from some of the classic New England dinosaur footprint sites. Somebody has very conveniently outlined the footprint with white chalk or something there, but we're going to zoom in real close into this area of this particular footprint. And when we do that, you may be able to see from where you're sitting that there are even details of the skin texture of this particular dinosaur, showing that they had a kind of a scaly foot sole, sort of like you get on the underside of the foot of an alligator. Okay, now, this is another slab that is in that collection in Amherst College. And this illustrates very nicely the kind of problem that I'm concerned with in my research. As you look at this slab, you see a number of footprints going every which way. And you notice some of them are fairly large, like this particular one right here. Others are rather smaller, this one right here. And then you come in other sizes in between. Now, the question that I have been interested in ever since I began working on fossils of this kind is the matter of how much information these footprints can provide about the kinds of animals that made them. Remember I said a few minutes ago that dinosaur footprints are sometimes very abundant in Mesozoic rocks, often considerably more abundant than dinosaur skeletons. And sometimes they provide us with our best, and in some cases our only, information about what kinds of dinosaurs were living in the area. So if we could interpret these footprints, we might be able to get some handle on how many different species of dinosaurs were living in an area at one time. And we might further be able to get some idea of what kinds of species those were, whether they were theropods of one kind or ornithopods of one kind or what have you. And my research has focused on the question of how much information of this kind we can extract from the footprints. How accurately can we hope to identify dinosaur footprints? And as you'll see in a few minutes, I've had to take a number of different approaches that at first glance might not seem directly relevant to the study of dinosaur footprints in trying to get at this particular question. Well, before I begin to talk about that, let's give you some idea of what some of these different kinds of animals look like. Now, these are artists' reconstructions of some of the dinosaur groups that I'm going to be talking about. They are based on reasonably complete skeletons, so the animals probably look more or less like the way they're depicted here. But obviously, what color they would have been, we have no information about that, but we can get some idea of how big they were, what their body proportions were like, and so forth. We'll start with the theropods, the meat-eating dinosaurs. These are three individuals of a small ceratosaurian meat-eating dinosaur known as Coelophysis, one of the first of the meat-eaters, an animal, I don't know, anywhere from 2 to 3 meters in length from nose to the tip of its tail. Here's a bigger type of ceratosaur. These are two individuals of an animal known as Dilophosaurus, an animal that in life would have been maybe 5 or 6 meters in length. This animal figured prominently in the movie Jurassic Park, but they took extensive liberties with the way they depicted it. They showed it about 1/3 of its size, and they gave it this weird flappy frill thing on the side of the head, and they made it spitting poison, none of which has any basis in reality. So, yay Hollywood. Now we have an example of an allosaur. This is Allosaurus itself, a fairly good-sized animal. This particular dinosaur would have probably been, I don't know, anywhere from 7 to 10 meters in total length. A pretty good-sized meat eater. And this is a type of dinosaur known as an ornithomimosaur, an ostrich dinosaur. And I think you can see why it's given that name. It has a very ostrich-like appearance to it. To give you some idea of the size of that animal, this is a very nice cast of the foot skeleton of one of these dinosaurs. And it'll show you some of the features of the foot quite nicely. Tyrannosaurs are among everybody's favorite meat-eating dinosaurs. This is a form known as Daspletosaurus, excuse me. This animal would have been about the same size as Allosaurus. And then we have the Dromaeosaurs. This is Dromaeosaurus itself. You don't get a very good idea because he's not facing the camera, being concerned with other things at the moment. These are the animals to which Deinonychus or Velociraptor also belong. And these, you recall, also figured prominently in Jurassic Park. We come now to some of the plant-eating dinosaurs. This is a little one right here. This is Pusanosaurus, an animal, one of the earliest of the plant-eating ornithischian dinosaurs, a wee little thing. And then there were also fairly good-sized plant-eating bipedal dinosaurs. This is a form known as Iguanodon, which would have been a very massive animal. I've worked with the skeletons of these in Brussels, and even though they weren't the biggest of the dinosaurs, they give such an impression of massiveness when you're right beside the skeletons that it's quite impressive. This animal probably weighed, ballpark figure, 3 or 4 tons when it was alive. And then, of course, we have the hadrosaurs, otherwise known as duck-billed dinosaurs. Some duck-billed dinosaurs obviously earned a name. They got those flattened sort of snouts. Some of them got kind of rococo headgear. Here we've got some Saurolophus with a kind of spike coming out the back of its head. This is another form, a Hypacrosaurus with a kind of dome on the back of its head. And finally, I thought I had another hadrosaur in there, but apparently not. So that'll give you some idea of the kinds of animals that I'll be talking about this evening. Let me put this down for a moment. It's going to be a bit of a multimedia presentation. I'm going to go back and forth between the transparencies and the slides over the course of the evening. As I've already said, in many rock units, you get a much better picture of what kinds of dinosaurs were present in the fauna from footprints than you do from dinosaur skeletons. And so the kind of question that I am interested in are basically these two questions here. Can we determine the number of distinct kinds of dinosaurs that were represented by footprints at any particular site? In other words, just a simple count of how many distinct types of species there were without consideration as to what the affinities of those species were. And further, can we associate these distinct kinds of dinosaur track makers with particular kinds of dinosaurs known from skeletal remains? And it's important to bear in mind here that we really don't know what the living foot of any dinosaurs was like. Dinosaurs are largely named on the basis of skeletal material, like this specimen that we have here. We don't know what the soft tissues would have been like. We can only make inferences about that. And so when you name a new kind of dinosaur, you are naming a skeleton. So when we try to associate a particular dinosaur fossilized footprint with a particular kind of dinosaur, what we are essentially doing is to try to make a correlation between a foot skeleton and a footprint that we think would have been made by that foot skeleton if you de-anorexed it and put all kinds of tissues around it to make it a living object. Now, I might need to make a brief digression here to talk a little bit about the term taxon, which I may be throwing around every so often. A taxon represents a category of classification. And for those of you who've had biology courses, the most familiar taxa, that's the plural of the word taxon, would be what we have in the classical Linnaean system, where you start out with classes of animals, then you go to orders, and then suborders, maybe families, on down to the genus and the species. And these terms that I'll be throwing around, like tyrannosaur, or allosaur, or ceratosaur, or ornithopod, those would represent different kinds of taxa. Now, I've stated in general terms here the kinds of questions that I'm going to be concerned with this evening, but I want to restate these in the form of some more specific questions, ways of trying to get at these kinds of more theoretical questions outlined above. So the questions we'll be addressing are, first, are the foot skeletons of different individuals of particular dinosaur species more similar in shape to each other than to the foot skeletons of other dinosaur species? Second, are footprints of a particular species more like each other than like the footprints of other species? Now, we can't approach that directly for dinosaurs, but I'll show you the indirect approach that I'm taking on that in a little bit. And finally, the third question, are the foot skeletons and footprints of different species in a particular group of animals more like each other than like foot skeletons and footprints of animals in other groups, other taxa? Well, those are the questions. Then how are we going to go about it? And this is where I have taken a somewhat different approach than people have generally done with dinosaur footprints before. Most people who work on dinosaur footprints will go out into the field, they will map, they will measure the footprints as they occur, they'll take a variety of measurements on those footprints, they'll compare them with footprints that are found in other parts of the world, and they'll say, yeah, this footprint is like another kind of footprint, and so we're going to use a certain label and say that they both belong to this footprint category, this footprint taxon. Now, I do that too in my work, but I've tried to go beyond that, a more biological approach, if you will, by trying to relate these footprint shapes to particular kinds of animals. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, I have made some fairly detailed measurements and observations on foot skeletons of as many different kinds of dinosaurs that have fossilized feet as I can. I have measured things on these foot skeletons that might be translated into footprint shapes. Things like overall lengths and widths of the toes of the dinosaurs, and of particular regions within those toes, the individual toe bones. Now, the term for an individual toe bone is a phalanx. The plural is the word phalanges. So basically what I'm doing is this. In the best case scenario, since we identify dinosaurs on the basis of their foot skeletons, then do the foot skeletons differ in a recognizable fashion across different kinds of dinosaurs so that you can tell the foot skeleton of one from the foot skeleton of a different species of dinosaur? If you can't do that, then there's very little chance you're going to be able to tell the footprint of one species of dinosaur from the footprints of another dinosaur species. Well, in approaching that kind of question, excuse me, there are a number of things that we can look at. First, this object, I know the light is a little dim, but this is the object of a living animal. dear, are we going to play with the lights? Okay. This is scary. All right, good. This is the foot, I should say, not of a dinosaur, or at least not in the usual sense of the word, but this is the footprint of a living animal, or, well, it was at one point the foot of a living animal. This is the foot of a large flightless bird, an emu. And as you're going to see later on this evening, I'm quite fond of emus. I've spent a lot of time with them. Now, perhaps you can see from where you're sitting that on the sole of the toes of this foot, there are no conspicuous swellings and constrictions along the length of the toe. These are digital pads. Like here you can see them fairly prominently on that particular foot, or toe, I should say. This is an actual emu footprint from an adult bird, and perhaps you can see the same objects there as well. Now, interestingly enough, you see the same thing in very well-preserved dinosaur footprints. This is the footprint not of a dinosaur, but of a small carnivorous dinosaur from New England, and perhaps you can see from where you're sitting that there are the same little swellings along the length of the toes in this particular dinosaur. Well, we're going to go back now to the slides, so let's see if I have remembered how to do this. Eventually I can learn anything. Just ask my wife. This is an X-ray of the foot of an emu. This is the same emu foot I was showing you a minute ago. And you can see, again, the soft tissues as a kind of ghostly outline around the foot skeleton. And I think you can see that, there are where you have the swellings in the toe on the soft tissues, these correspond with the joints between the individual phalanges or toe bones. Now, this kind of thing is not restricted to emus. You can see the same thing in alligators. And it's important to note, as an aside here, both birds and alligators and other crocodilians are the closest living relatives of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, birds, crocodilians are part of all of the same group of animals that are collectively known as archosaurs. And so, if we find things that are in common in both crocodilians and in birds, we might have some reason for suspecting that the same thing would have occurred in dinosaurs as well. Now, if we look at the X-rays of the alligator foot, I draw your attention to particularly here in the front foot. You notice that there's some bright things, like there, and there, and there. Those represent pins that I stuck into the pads on the undersurfaces of the toes of the alligator. And most of them do seem to be associated, again, with the joints between the toes. This one looks a little bit odd. I'm not sure whether it really is off, where the pad really does not coincide with the joint, or whether it just got positioned in an odd way when we took the X-ray. But the main point remains the same. If we've got well-preserved dinosaur footprints that show the individual digital pads nicely, we can use these, since the swellings correspond to the joints between the toes in modern relatives of dinosaurs, to make some estimate about the lengths of the individual toe bones in the foot. So in a footprint, we can measure not only the overall length of the toe from the foot impression, but if the footprint is well enough preserved, we can say something about the relative proportions of the bones within the toes. And this gives us something we can now start to compare with dinosaur foot skeletons in an attempt to see how closely we can correlate between dinosaur footprints and the skeletons of the animals that made them. The second aspect of my project is to look at the foot and soft tissue, or toe soft tissues in modern relatives of birds. I guess I just said that already, I'm sorry. We're also going to look at the feet of birds as seen in footprints, and also in the actual undersides of the feet of the birds as well. And again, we're going to be asking the question, Are birds that are closely related to one another, first of all, members of the same species? Do they have foot configurations, not just in the skeleton, but in the soft tissues of the foot, in the stuff that would be making the footprint, such that members of the same species are more likely or more similar to one another than they are to different species? And beyond that, can we use these variations in foot shape to group species together in a manner that is consistent with their known relationships? And finally, are there any features in the footprints themselves of modern animals, in the way the animals are actually interacting with the substrate, things that might not be easily seen from the anatomy alone, things like angles between the toes, for example? Can we look and see if these things act to group footprint makers together in a manner that is consistent with their known relationships? So that's the approach that I'm taking. I'm looking at foot skeletons of dinosaurs. I'm looking at the soft tissues of modern animals like alligators and birds. And finally, I'm looking at the footprints, not of dinosaurs in this case, but of some modern animals, the birds, that have very dinosaur-like feet. So what kind of results do we get when we do this kind of thing? We'll put this down for a moment, and we'll go back to our transparency. This first transparency, and my wife told me I should not use a lot of these, that I should concentrate on showing lots of pretty pictures of animals and things in my talk, because a lot of people don't like graphs. So I'll try to hold these to a minimum this evening. What are we looking at here? This is simply looking at the proportions of the toes, the lengths of the toes in different kinds of dinosaurs that could have been making footprints. And we're expressing these as ratios simply. Here's the ratio of the length of the inner toe, digit 2, to the middle toe, digit 3, along this axis, and the ratio of the outer toe, digit 4, to digit 3 in this axis. And I know the statisticians in the crowd will be angry with me for using ratios. This is considered a very bad thing to do, but for graphical purposes, to just show how things spread out on a graph, this conveys what I'm trying to tell you better than any other graphical technique I have found. So what are we seeing here? If we have points that plot in this region of the graph, this means that the middle toe of the dinosaur foot, this one right here, is relatively long in comparison with either the outer or the inner toe. And I think you can see that there's a kind of pattern in the points there. And if you don't see the pattern, I'll tell you what it is. The theropods, the meat-eating dinosaurs and their relatives, I have shown with dark symbols here and there. The ornithopods and the primitive ornithischians, the heterodontosaurs all the way down through the hadrosaurs and certain bipedal ceratopsians are more open symbols. And I think you'll see there is a tendency for the theropod dinosaurs, the meat-eaters, to have a relatively long middle toe in comparison with the other kinds of dinosaurs. So there's at least a gross feature that you can use to try to distinguish among these different categories of track makers. On the other hand, the news isn't entirely encouraging because there's a lot of overlap between the plant eaters and the meat eaters in this feature. And within the meat eaters or within the plant eaters, there don't seem to be a whole lot of separations among different kinds or subcategories of dinosaurs. So the point of this comparison seems to be that you can perhaps tell major groups of dinosaurs apart on the basis of this comparison of relative toe length, but it doesn't seem to give us a whole lot of information for looking at particular groups or taxa within those major groups. Another comparison. In this particular transparency, what we are looking at is how fat or how broad or wide the foot skeleton is, the toe skeleton is, compared with the length of the toe. So we're doing it for the middle toe in this case, digit 3, the middle toe, the length of it versus a good estimate of what the width of the toe would be, the width of the toe bone that is halfway out along the length of the toe. Phalanx 3-2, the second toe bone of digit 3. And some of you will notice that I've gone and used log axes. Most of you will have no idea what that means, but for those of you who do know what that means and wonder why I did this, it's because I get a lot of great big dinosaurs and some very small dinosaurs, and if I didn't do this kind of manipulation, the little dinosaur points would be a kind of meaningless blur in this portion of the graph. I'm sure you're happy to know that. So what kinds of patterns can we see in this? And again, there does seem to be at least a gross difference between the meat-eating dinosaurs on the one hand and the plant eaters on the other. Again, the meat-eating dinosaurs are the solid or darker points. The plant eaters are the more open symbols. And I think you'll note that the meat eaters tend to be along this portion of the graph. The plant eaters tend to be further up along this way, and then there are some plant eaters that are really way up here. Some of the what that is saying is that plant-eating dinosaurs tend to have fatter toes for their lengths, and there are some plant-eating dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs and the iguanodonts, that have really fat toes. Well, to see this for yourself, in case you don't believe it in a graph, let's go on to the slide. This shows 2-foot skeletons. On the left, we have a foot skeleton of Iguanodon, a big plant-eating dinosaur. On the right, we have something that is called Albertosaurus, but may actually be something else, but it's at least a Tyrannosaur. And I think you can see that the kind of comparison that we were looking at there, the Iguanodons would be plotting about there on the graph, the Tyrannosaurus about there, and yes, indeed, the meat-eating dinosaurs do tend to have longer and skinnier toes than do the plant eaters. We might actually use this to try to identify footprints and at least say that that is a track of a big meat eater as opposed to a big plant eater. Here we have a footprint from one of my sites in Texas, a fairly good-sized one. There is my foot to give you the scale. This would have been a fairly big dinosaur, and I think you can see this animal tends to have fairly long and skinny toe marks, and so this is probably the footprint of a big carnivorous dinosaur. In contrast, look at this footprint from a site near Denver, Colorado, where you have much shorter and stubbier toes. And so this kind of footprint is more likely made by a big plant-eating dinosaur on the order of Iguanodon, or not necessarily Iguanodon itself, but at least a member of that particular group of large plant-eating dinosaurs. So we've got at least something that we can use to make a gross discrimination among major groups of dinosaurs. But can we do it any finer than that? Can we perhaps find features that would help us to tell the footprints of one kind of theropod group from that of another? Could we tell the footprint and the foot skeleton of an allosaur from that of a tyrannosaur or from a ceratosaur? And this gives the results of my attempt to see if something like this could be done. I know you can't see this from where you are, but these represent a variety of different kinds of meat-eating dinosaurs where I was able to make measurements of the individual phalanges along the lengths of the toes, and then standardize them as though they had come from a foot of the common length, and then simply let the computer see if there are any patterns in the data. Which ones of these are more similar to one another than others are? So it generates this kind of goofy-looking cluster pattern, and I get some bad news when I do this. Basically, all the really big meat-eating dinosaurs are up here. They're all very similar to one another, regardless of their phylogenetic or evolutionary relationships. A tyrannosaur has a foot very much like an allosaur, very much like a big ceratosaur. And the little smaller kinds of dinosaur, of theropod dinosaurs are here. Some of these patterns make a little bit of sense in terms of the relationships of these animals, but in other cases they just grow together in a crazy sort of fashion. So on the basis of phalangeal proportions, the story is not as encouraging as I would have hoped. maybe we cannot say much more than to say that a footprint is made by a big meat-eating dinosaur, and maybe we can't say exactly what kind of meat-eating dinosaur it was that made that footprint. And now for something completely different. We'll go back to the transparency to illustrate where we were in the presentation. Yes. One of the things that might affect whether footprints are more similar to those of others of the same species or not could be the growth of the animals. Dinosaurs hatched from eggs. They would have started out as small dinosaurs, and over the course of the lifetime of the animal grown to be a very big dinosaur. Some people have suggested that there might have been conspicuous marked differences in the shape of the foot of dinosaurs as they grew up, such that the footprint of a baby Tyrannosaurus, not only would it be smaller than the footprint of an adult Tyrannosaurus, but it would have been quite different in shape. So one of the things I've been interested in my research is to see if we can determine whether this is likely to have been so or not. It would be nice to be able to do this for dinosaur skeletons, but you run into the problem of sample sizes. Unfortunately, there just are not that many complete skeletons of dinosaurs, and we don't have that many species where we can look at the shape of the foot from very young individuals all the way to fully grown individuals. Now, in those species where you can look at it, and I've got data of this sort, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of change as you go from young ones to adults. But we can supplement that by looking at crocodilians. Again, I've said these are modern animals that are closely related to dinosaurs, members of the same group. And so one of the things I have been doing in my work is studying alligators. I was in Louisiana last May during a rather grisly kind of project where a large number of alligators had to be killed. These were animals that had been in a kind of semi-wild breeding program. So these animals had been given rations, given food over the years. They had consequently grown to be bigger than wild gators generally do, and they had become habituated to humans and associated humans with food. Consequently, earlier last year, when the state of Louisiana, in a budget crisis, decided they couldn't keep this experiment going, these alligators could not be turned loose into the wild because they'd have swum down to Baton Rouge and taken off half the population or something. So the Louisiana Department of Wildlife decided the animals had to be killed. And so they sacrificed a number of these animals. This is one of them. But it was unfortunate for the individual alligators, but it was nice for persons interested in various aspects of crocodilian biology because it gave us a whole bunch of specimens that we could do all kinds of fun things with. So a number of people from around the world were on hand, and as each of these animals was shot, we measured it, we sexed it. In case you want to know how to sex an alligator, they have a little slit at the base of the tail, and you stick your finger up that, and you feel around for something. And if it's a live gator, when you do that and it objects to that, it's a boy. I won't go into any more details than that. Anyway, I have, in addition to these sacrificed alligators in Louisiana, I've gathered data on crocodilian alligators in South Carolina. Animals were more fortunate because these were ones we could capture and release, all the way from very young alligators, just beyond the hatchling stage, to animals 3 or almost 4 meters in length. So I've made a lot of measurements of the individual toe lengths and of the individual pads and claws within those toes to see if there are any differences in the shape as you go from baby alligators to adult alligators. Now, I'm not going to show you any data on this, so you don't have to worry about seeing a graph, simply because I have more work to do on this project. I'm going to be gathering data on more alligators in Florida this year. But the numbers that I have so far suggest that they don't change much in shape as you go from babies to adults. That baby alligators have feet that are essentially miniature copies of the feet of adult alligators. And we can't leave this, of course, without showing you what the foot of an alligator looks like. So there's what the hind foot of an adult alligator, in this case, is like. And then we come to the part of my project dealing with footprints. Again, in trying to see whether we can associate footprint shapes with relationships among these different kinds of footprint makers, we can't do this directly from dinosaur footprints. If we could, my project wouldn't be necessary in the first place. But we can look at modern animals with a three-toed foot that walk in a manner rather like dinosaurs, and that are closely related to dinosaurs. In fact, by many people's thinking, are modern dinosaurs, directly descended from the theropods, and that gets us to the birds, big ground birds like emus. And so I have done a lot of work on collecting footprints of birds in zoos all over the country, particularly here at the Fort Wayne Zoo, and then making some of the same kinds of measurements on them that are customarily made on dinosaur footprints, and then seeing, are the footprints of different emus more like each other than they are like the footprints of other species of birds? And do the various bird species make footprints that are similar or different from one another in a manner that parallels what we know their relationships to be? Well, before I answer that question, let me show you some of the kinds of birds I've had the pleasure of working with in this project. These are 3 emus here at the zoo. Emus are a pleasure to work with. They're usually very friendly kinds of birds. They are not mean like ostriches or rheas or sometimes cassowaries. I have nothing but nice things to say about emus. These guys are a little bit different. This is a cassowary. Like the emu, it's a big Australian bird, and it's closely related to the emu. It's probably the closest living relative of the emu, which is an important point. But its disposition is quite different from that of an emu. If you notice, this is the foot of the animal, the left foot, and on the inner toe, they have this whopping big claw. And if a cassowary gets mad at you, it jumps up in the air and whacks out at you. And these have been known to disembowel and kill both domestic animals and humans. So one has to be very careful when one works with cassowaries. These are a couple lesser rheas in the Oklahoma City Zoo. The emu, the rhea, the cassowary, these are members of a large group of birds known as ratites. They are all closely related to one another. And here we have other things. This is a thing called a weka. It's not closely related to the emus at all, but it is a ground bird, a weird thing from New Zealand. This is a buff-crested bustard. One of my favorites, a crested serena. It's got a very nifty little top knot of feathers at the top of its head. These are curassows, animals that are related to the pheasants. This is a Philby's partridge. The blue-eared pheasant, or as one of my students called it, the Mr. Spock bird. Himalayan monals, another kind of pheasant. And so that'll give you some idea. I've actually worked with about 40 different species of birds that spend a lot of their time on the ground where they could make footprints. And the procedure is to go into the zoo and collect their footprints. This is what we're doing here at the Fort Wayne Zoo. This, I think, will give you a very good feeling about why I think these are good animals to study if you're interested in dinosaur footprints. So we go out, allow the animals to make the prints. We then pour plaster of Paris into those footprints, letting them harden, and then afterward, you get a very nice replica of the footprint that can be brought back to the laboratory for study. Now, in the laboratory, we digitize the footprints according to certain anatomical landmarks. This particular transparency shows you a ghostly outline of a footprint, in this case of an emu. Each one of these numbers represents an anatomical landmark on the footprint that can be recognized from one footprint to the next. They're different kinds of birds. And then the lines across them represent various linear measurements that are made from those anatomical landmarks. And so you can see we've got quite an extensive range of data there to work with. So the first question then becomes, are the footprints of emus, for the animals for which I have the most footprint data, are they more like one another than they are like the footprints of other kinds of birds? This is another kind of cluster diagram similar to what I showed you a few minutes ago for the dinosaur foot skeletons, but this time based on the measurements of the footprints. And again, I first had to standardize the footprints to a common length before I could do this. Otherwise, all of the little footprints would have been similar to one another, and all of the bigger footprints would have been like one another, regardless of who had made them. The red dots are footprints made by emus. And I'm happy to say that for the most part, yes, the emu footprints are more like each other. Each one of these represents a different bird having made the footprints. So in general, the emu footprints are more like each other than they are like the footprints of other kinds of birds. You also get some other clusterings that make sense. I'm happy to see, for example, that the two individuals of cassowary for which I collected footprints are more similar to each other than they are to other kinds of birds. And footprints of two species of rhea are fairly similar to one another. Beyond that, however, it goes to hell in a handbasket. Because if you know anything about the relationships of birds, some of you probably do, these things are not clustering in a manner that is very similar to their phylogenetic relationships. This particular diagram shows what our current understanding of the evolutionary relationships of the different groups of birds based on a variety of data, measurements of body form in the birds, and also on molecular data, comparing DNA sequences and things like that. And the upshot, I don't know if the, can that be lowered? Well, I guess I can see what I need. Up at the very top here, we see a group for the ratites, the Struthionoforms, which would include the emus and the cassowaries and the rheas. And they cluster together, they are in this group. And then you have a number of other groups that are not particularly closely related to this group. I'm not going to spend a lot of time making the comparisons of what we see here and here, except to say that there is not much correspondence. Footprints of members of the same species, in the case of the emu, do seem to be more like one another than they are like footprints of other species. But if you try to make comparisons beyond the species level, and to say, do different species within the same group tend to cluster together apart from species in other groups on the basis of footprint shape? And the answer seems to be no. Bummer. Well, the measurements that we were looking at in that particular analysis were kind of gross measurements, overall lengths of the toes and things like that. Could it be that if you looked at the soft tissues, the digital pads, or the spaces between individual digital pads, or the lengths of the claw marks, perhaps these would be more similar between species that are closely related to one another than they are across from species that are not particularly closely related. Most of the footprints that I collected were not good enough to answer that kind of question, particularly for the smaller birds. You have to have just the right kinds of conditions to preserve very delicate footprints, so I couldn't get that. But what I could do is look at study skins in museum collections. Things like this, where you've got the dried down remnants of the foot of an animal that was collected for study purposes. And I can look at the way the feet are in those particular specimens. And when you do this, well, the news is not particularly encouraging. Here we have an emu, and you can see the nice little pads on the toes, the number of pads, you can see the claw marks. This particular animal, however, is not an emu. This is an animal known as a corygustan, which is not closely related to ratites at all. It is not a ratite. is instead more closely related to the cranes. But perhaps from where you are, you can see that this foot and this foot are very hard to tell apart. If you didn't know who this animal was, you would think that it was a dinky little emu from the basis of its foot. And I have a footprint that I have collected of a cory bustard that you're welcome to come and look at after my presentation, compared with my emu footprint. And I think you'll see, well, they're very, very similar. The same kind of thing occurs if you look at other kinds of birds. Across, in this particular photograph, slide, I've got photographs of birds that are vertically arranged, like here and here, are animals that are closely related to one another. So here we have, this is one type of tinamou, here's another kind of tinamou. Here we have a kiwi, which is a type of rat-type bird, which would be related then to the rhea that we have here. And here we would have a pheasant that is all by itself. Now I have arranged these footprint photos in the way I have to tell you the bad news. These are all quite similar to one another in the configurations of the toe pads, the spaces between the pads, but these birds are not at all closely related to one another. So the fine features of foot skull tissues, the things like the toe pads that might be preserved in very good, very well preserved footprints, they don't seem to give us a clear picture about the evolutionary relationships of the animals that own those feet. I can make the same point by looking at not just study skins, but footprints of some fairly good-sized birds, where they are large enough and heavy enough to sink into the substrate to preserve some detail of the underside of the toes. Here we have 3 footprints of emus, a young individual and these are 2 emus, a young individual and an adult. This is a cassowary, a little harder to see, but you can make out the really long claw on the inner toe of the cassowary, which is quite different from the much smaller inner claw on the foot of an emu, even though these animals are very closely related. Their common ancestor existed no more than a few million years ago. This is a rhea, which would be closely related to all of these guys. This, however, is an ostrich. An ostrich is another rat type, very closely related to emus and cassowaries and rheas, but it only has 2 toes. A very different kind of foot shape. And then here's our friend, the cory bustard, which actually has a very emu-like foot, and if you didn't know who this was, you would think it was, like I said, probably an emu. And here we have 2 other kinds. These are, in this case, footprints of extinct birds. This is from a monstrous creature called a moa from New Zealand, probably related to the ratites, but distantly so. This, on the other hand, is from a bird called a dromornithid, a gigantic Australian thing related to ducks, of all things. I defy you to be able to group these footprints together on the basis of their overall shape and get a pattern that would reflect the relationships of the animals that once made those footprints. So what do we conclude from all of this? I think it's likely because that if you look at the footprints in any particular area on a local basis or even a regional basis, if you have some footprints that are very similar to one another in their appearance on a local basis, then there's a good possibility that they were made by the same kind of animal. You can also then take into account the size of the footprints as well. So on a local or regional basis, I suspect that differences in footprint shape can be used to get at least a minimum estimate of the number of species that were living in that area. I'm encouraged in thinking this by the fact that, for example, in the case of my emu footprints, they all seem to be more similar to one another than they were to footprints of animals in other species. And so I suspect that quite often this will be the case if we tried to apply it to dinosaurs as well. We probably don't have to worry much about changes in shape as the animals grew up from very young to adult creatures. And so that's a positive result. However, it is probably not safe to make the assumption that if you have two footprints that are quite similar in size and shape in widely separated geographic areas, that the animals that made those footprints were necessarily closely related to one another. And last, what is perhaps going to be, if you're at least a footprint specialist, a fairly controversial conclusion, I'm very skeptical about whether it is safe to do this. There are some workers on the on dinosaur footprints, work on three-toed footprints of the kind that I study, who think that if we see a footprint of a given shape, which shape can be called Megalosaurus, in places like North America or Europe and Asia, they would conclude from that that those rocks are all about the same age because they were made by animals that were closely related to one another. My work seems to suggest that you can have footprints that are fairly similar in shape, and the animals are not very closely related to one another. So I would be very cautious about doing that kind of procedure. So the take-home message from my presentation tonight is that you can do some kinds of things. I think you can use footprints to do local paleoecological studies and get some idea of the number of kinds of dinosaurs that were living in the area. I think you can only get a fairly coarse impression of what those dinosaurs were. You might be able to say that we've got one kind of big eating dinosaur, and we've got another kind of big plant-eating dinosaur. But we probably can't say for sure exactly what group of large meat-eating dinosaurs those footprints should be assigned to, or what species of big plant-eating dinosaur made those particular footprints. So I think you can get a limited amount of paleoecological information from the study of three-toed dinosaur footprints. However, I think using dinosaur footprints to correlate rocks in different areas to try to say that these tell us that the rocks are of the same age is a very dangerous procedure. And if you're not careful, well, the footprints might come back and squash you. Thank you very much.
A little slow there, at least a little bit. I realize I never did announce what the title of the talk is, but after the talk is pretty good to be able to realize that we have been talking about, or at least Jim has been talking about, skeletons, big dumb birds, and up to my you-know-what in alligators. And I think you've definitely demonstrated these are some unorthodox approaches to the study of dinosaur footprints, and so maybe it was better to wait till afterwards to be able to have the title. We actually have a few minutes if anybody has any questions for Dr. Farlow. Back there.
I don't have your book.
That's Frank. And we don't want to, I don't have my glasses on, so I couldn't tell it was you, Frank. Okay.
That was an inside joke.
Do you find the alligator footprints to be most similar to carnivorous or herbivorous dinosaur footprints?
I haven't even made the comparison. I don't think it's terribly relevant, actually, simply because alligators in the hind foot, which is what I would be interested in, you're going to have a four-toed foot on the alligator hind foot, whereas the dinosaurs that I'm looking at are largely three-toed. And they're bipedal as well, yeah. I think there was somebody up there somewhere.
Do you think if you study the forearms, that you see something different in these between herbivorous and carnivorous?
Well, you certainly do have differences in shape. A lot of the meat-eating dinosaurs are going to have hooks on the claws. They're like meat hooks. But I have not looked at that simply because, I'm interested in footprints, and these animals habitually walked on their hind legs and didn't do handstands. In the case of the tyrannosaurs, they would have found it quite difficult to do so.
Except for worry, though, they really wouldn't use their feet to eat. I guess they would tear the meat apart.
There's been a lot of speculation about what the male wants to anchor the female. I'm always suspicious of explanations of that sort because I know what vertebrate paleontologists are like, and I know what they were like growing up, and I suspect that when we can't figure out what the function of a structure is in an extinct animal, we assume that it's related to mating because we were all geeks that couldn't get dates at some point in our lives.
Any other questions? Well, I thank you all for coming. If you do decide to come down here, watch it. There's wires here along the floor here. There's also a reception out back, and thank you very much, and thank you again, Jim.